series from the Office of Graduate Research at Flinders University. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, and I am deeply excited by this podcast. Wonderful listeners, I travel around the world to bring you fabulousness, and wow, have we got some fabulousness today. Dr. Kevin Moore is the Director of the National Football Museum in the truly beautiful Manchester, educated at Leeds Beckett, and with strong ties to the University of Central Lancashire, that we might talk about shortly, and the University of Leicester. He is a leader. He is a thinker and a leader and thinker in museum studies, popular cultural studies, football studies, leisure studies and sports studies. I hope you agree with everything so far, right?
Yes.
Good. He's published many books, including my favourite book. In fact, I would put this book in my top 10 books written of all time, Museums and Popular Culture. And he's currently the chair, and I only just found this out recently, the chair of the Sports Heritage Network. Unbelievable. So you are a legend. Thank you for inviting me to Manchester. How are you going, Kevin?
Very well, thank you. Delighted to have you here, Taurus. Fantastic to see you.
Well, I'm thrilled, and it's been 4 years since we last saw each other. Steve and I had the pleasure of attending the launch of the National Football Museum in its movement to Manchester, and obviously we're quite involved in visiting a great deal the museum when it was in the wonderful Preston. So 4 years on, mate, how has the movement of the museum to Manchester from Preston progressed?
Great. We were sad to leave Preston. There was a chance to keep the Preston site open had funding been found locally from Preston City Council and Lancashire County Council. Now, they thought about that, but it's quite apparent now, had we stayed there or tried to keep that second site open, that would not have happened, because what's happened since 2012 is massive cuts in the funding for Lancashire County Council and Preston City Council, and very sadly last week 5 of Lancashire County museums, wonderful museums, including Museum of the Textile Industry, Cotton Industry in Lancashire, you know, the key part of the Industrial Revolution, were closed to the public, with a vague possibility that it may be reopened by a private group or by volunteers. This is truly tragic. I think they're still open to Queen Street Mill in Burnley, may still be open to school groups, but this is the sign of the times here of austerity, museums closing. We're doing great, but it's a very bad time in the cultural sector in the UK. This is pre-Brexit, this is just austerity, tremendous cuts on local authorities, and it's now biting in that museums are actually closing. Had we stayed in Preston, we'd have closed. We wouldn't have got the funding, there's no question, and we wouldn't be here now. The National Football Museum has only survived and prospered by coming to Manchester. Our collections are still in Preston. We've given half the site back to the football club because we didn't need it.
Yes.
They put a charity in there that works with people who've had heart disease and heart attacks, and that's great because it brings men to football stadium. They'll come and see a charity and get some medical care because somehow football is that hook. There's a health centre on the other side of the ground. By the same token, you can't get men to seek medical attention if you're connected to sport and football. Warrington Wolves Rugby League ground has got a health centre in it again.
This is unbelievable.
Yeah, I know. It's a great idea. It actually gets men to come. Absurd, crazy, but they'll actually go to the doctor or to seek health advice if it's somewhere they're comfortable with a football or a rugby league ground.
That is
unbelievable. Fascinating.
It is. I will also draw, while we're talking Preston, because it's obviously a place close to my heart, close to your heart as well, and we all know in the third tier small cities and large towns, you know, it's a challenging economic, social, political environment anyway. You did leave the archive, I think, back at Preston.
Yes, the collections and archive is still there, that's right.
And how do you manage that? What is the relationship now with the archive?
Yeah, I mean, it's only 45 minutes away.
Yeah.
It's not too bad, and researchers come from all over the world still and can go there. It's only 45. In global terms, it's not far from Manchester to Preston, is it? The train may not be great, but I still live in Preston. So
the train station's amazing. I think Preston train station is one of the most beautiful in the world.
It's a very nice station. So I come in from Preston. It's not too bad. Well, I come from slightly nearer, but it's not too far away. Ideally, would the collections be here in Manchester as well? But yes, but this building is a visitor experience. It's not big enough, actually, for us to house the collections. It's not ideal, but then, of course, with many museums, the collections are stored elsewhere. It's not a major problem. It's not a major problem. Collections are growing, so we kept half that space, and they're growing. We've had some fantastic new acquisitions this year, which I may come to. So we were sad to leave Preston. It closed to the public. The funding couldn't be found, but we've come here, and an entirely new museum. We learnt a lot from what worked and didn't work in Preston. It mostly worked, but we could make this even better. We could make this even better in an absurd way. As the head of Visit England, England's tourism organiser, said to me, he said, you didn't know it, but in some ways that was a 9-year pilot project, 2001 to 2010, a 900,000 people focus group for you to learn what works, what doesn't work. We're not disrespecting what we did. The public had a great time there. But we've gone up another level now. So it was 100,000 visitors a year. This building is more than twice the size. Everything's new. The objects are not new, of course, though there are many new objects on display. But it was a complete reinvention of the museum. So we opened in July 2012. And visitor numbers, over 450,000 the first year. And they've actually grown, which is a surprise. Because normally year two's your peak, and then you start to level off. We haven't. And we think it's the quality of the product, the museum experience. People love it. We're over 500,000 visitors a year now. It's partly because people love the museum. Big increase in overseas visitors. They were projected by the experts who forecast what audience we'd get. They said you'll get 350,000 visitors a year. About 10% will be from overseas. That seemed a sensible prediction based on data, and that was pretty right to begin with, though we got 450,000 visitors. Overseas visitors were 10, 12, 15%, and they just kept growing, which has really surprised us. Overseas visitors in the last survey we did were 35% of our audience.
That's stunning. Which
is stunning, isn't it? Now, this reflects several things. The National Football Museum is a great place to come. People want to come. We're in Manchester. Two big football teams, City and United, overseas games.
Great airport.
Yeah, a really good airport. There's a tourist route round Britain. People often come back through Manchester between London and Edinburgh and Glasgow. Short breaks in the city. For every flight that's going out to Barcelona, there's a flight coming back to Manchester, and it's popular. And a lot of people from overseas coming to watch Manchester United and Manchester City.
Well, thank you for saying Manchester City. You knew you had to say it for this particular conversation. Fantastic.
Growing number of people coming to see City as well. So.
It is fantastic. And can I just say, too, as a sideline, mate, the museum was closed this morning for a royal visit. So Kate and Wills actually came and had a royal visit. But when they left, you didn't see this because I was outside, you were obviously in the museum. Actually, they all left and all the people waiting for the royal tour left. But then this huge group of people actually were waiting for them to go so the museum would reopen. So it shows you the scale and the scope of it. So all these people waiting out the front for all sort of the paparazzi and so forth to leave so they can actually get on with the museum.
Great. We're delighted with that. As a result, the museum's very busy today. So, we were delighted to welcome Prince William and Kate. He's president of the Football Association. And though he's a figurehead, he has talked very candidly about how he thinks the FA needs to reform and reflect more diversity and inclusion, the role of women, people of black and minority ethnic backgrounds. He thinks the FA needs to reform itself, and he's spoken very candidly about this. And I agree with him 100%. It needs to modernise, and this has been a problem for some time. I think the signs are encouraging with Martin Glenn, the new chief executive, and now a new chairman, though I think Greg Dyke was very keen to modernise the FA. It's long overdue. We work with the FA, but we're completely independent of them.
And also I think you in the museum, and it is your politics too, and I adore you as a human being and I respect you as a scholar and also as someone working in the museum, you made a commitment to think about representation properly in terms of football. Think about women in football when it wasn't the trendy topic that it is now. Think about players of colour, fans of colour, when really Stuart Clark's work was perhaps the only representation of that. Yes. And you made a decision early on when it wasn't popular to think about football in and about the world.
Yes, and the same true here. to get the museum experience right, we thought about all the different audiences coming. We thought about young children. We thought about intergenerational, going around the galleries together. We had a series of groups of people. Okay, let's call them focus groups. So the groups of people we consulted with. They didn't tell us what we were going to do, but we consulted with them because they're our audience. We are creating the displays of the museum for them. Ultimately, it is for the visitor, not for us. But it has to be historically accurate, and it has to reflect as far as we can be. Of course, we have an ideological view, but as far as we can, an objective view of the game, or actually not tell people what to think, but to give all sides of each story and to do it through people's stories. Very interesting. One group was football fans, hardcore, keen football fans. And what they said to us, oh, crikey, we're not racist, sexist and homophobic and hooligans, but you're going to have a lot in the museum again, aren't you, about racism and sexism and homophobia, and it'll make all football fans look like that. We'd rather you played that down, and the hooligan and stuff. And we listened to that, and we thought, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to overemphasise it, but there are still major problems in English football with racism, sexism, hooliganism, and homophobia, and they are going to be in the museum, and that's really, really important to where we stand. Diversity and inclusion in our staff, in our volunteers, and in the stories that we tell in the museum. But we did tell these stories in Preston. There are even more here. To tell the story of Justin Fashanu here in the museum is tremendously important.
It really is, and that's why you're an amazing human being, and this is a leadership organisation, a leadership museum, and I think we need to be following this example. But you've already mentioned the importance of Manchester, and thankfully you mentioned Manchester City, so thank you very much for that, Steve. We're thinking of you, darling one. But how are you and the museum engaging with the very complicated and also very rich history of Manchester's sporting culture and history, which is very different from Preston's? How are you working with that?
Yes, I mean, that's why we're here, ultimately. We were running into financial difficulties in Preston. The football bodies weren't going to back us anymore. What triggered it is the Football Foundation said it wasn't going to fund us anymore, and we were only getting £100,000 a year from DCMS, and we were the only sports museum or museum of popular culture getting any money from DCMS out of a budget of £400 million. So I'm afraid, to government, football wasn't important enough.
That's right.
The football bodies decided it wasn't important enough. Their view of Preston anyway was, well, it's great what you've done, but it's in the wrong place. You're not getting the big enough audience. You've done it for heritage. Don't put it in Preston. We got approached by Lord Treesman as chairman of the FA to move it lock, stock and barrel into Wembley Stadium. At that point, the North West Regional Development Agency said we don't want to lose it to the region, and brokered a deal whereby it stayed in the North West, and Manchester City Council made us a fantastic offer to come here. This building, the Urbis building, would be converted to become the National Folk Museum. They would underwrite the £8.5 million capital to create the wonderful new displays and do some improvements to the building inside that needed it, escalator, new stairs, etc., and give us £1.95 million a year in revenue funding, which is what they were already putting into the building when it was Urbis, the Museum of Urban Life. So it wasn't costing the council taxpayer Manchester any more money, except the £8.5 million capital, but working with Manchester City Council, we managed to get about £4 million, just under £4 million from the European Regional Development Fund. So this is, whatever people's views are on Brexit, this is half funded by the European Union. We're very grateful for the EADF for funding that enabled this to happen. And so, in terms of Manchester City Council, very keen on its football offer for tourism, and very much a sports city more widely. They have Sports City, they've got the velodrome for the cycling, which is why it's the centre of UK cycling. It's where all the gold medalists have been produced. Taekwondo is here for the UK team. Paralympic swimming is here. Manchester is very keen to be a sports city, and all of that as a legacy of the Commonwealth Games. Yeah. That all comes from 2002. And then the fantastic investment by the new owners from the Middle East in Manchester City, which has completely transformed East Manchester. Terribly polluted, industrial, derelict wasteland of land, completely transformed, massive investment, working with the City Council, and those facilities are open to the local community. So it isn't just that it's a gated place where multimillionaire footballers play. Of course, the stadium itself came from the Commonwealth Games. I'm told on good authority, there's a view here that, the leader of the council, Sir Richard Leese, and the chief exec then at the time of the Commonwealth Games, Sir Howard Bernstein, were City fans and they gave City a stadium. It's not true. As I understand it, first choice was the FA.
Yes.
It was offered to move to not build a new Wembley at Wembley, but to extend
right,
the Commonwealth Stadium.
That.
And then Manchester United to come back to Manchester because Manchester United are in Trafford. They're in another borough.
That's right.
And to expand and grow and have a completely new stadium here. So Manchester City were actually third choice. But they've turned out to be a fantastic third choice and with their new owners. So that's transformed. So Manchester is very proud to be a great sporting city, but very much for the local community as well, and isn't just about football. Of course it's known around the world for football, for Manchester United, and now, though City have just as long a history, it's also because of the Premier League and the new owners that City are winning the league and are back up there, right at the top again. But this is important. This is a city that's proud of other sports, to the point where the official, there will be one in London as well, but the official Olympic and Paralympic parade is on next Monday here in Manchester, coming past the museum as part of its tour. And that reflects that so many of the gold medalists in the Paralympics and Olympics they may not have been born in Manchester, but they train in Manchester because of the facilities that are here. So it is a real sports-mad city. The world knows it for football, but it's more than that.
And, of course, know it for this fantastic museum as well. Now, you've mentioned Urbis. I love this building with a passion. I love it as a piece of architecture. I love the shape of it. I love the walls. I take hundreds of photographs just of the walls, bits and pieces of the walls. It is a magnificent building, one of my most favourite buildings in the world, really. And I loved it when it was working with the Museum of the City of Urban Cultures. So how have you found moving the Football Museum into a museum that was configured for a different project? How did you find that?
Well, the first thing to say is I love the building. I think it's brilliant. It's a fantastic piece of architecture. So it's a great building. Let's start with that. It's beautiful. And people just come to photograph it. We know that. And every time you look at it, I come to work every day here for 4 years. 5 now, because we're here a year before we opened. It just looks different. Different light, different angles. You see a different angle on the same building. You don't get blasé about it. No. So it is one of my favourite buildings. In some ways, I feel very sad that Urbis ended. I didn't think it worked as a museum of urban life, but when it changed into a museum effectively of popular culture, it was hit and miss, but some of the exhibitions were tremendously good. And as I'd written a book on museums and popular culture and said that museums should embrace popular culture, effectively, when Manchester City Council took the decision, not us, to close Urbis in its latest incarnation, and it become the National Football Museum, effectively my actions had led to the closure of a museum of popular culture, which was very sad. But a different museum of a different aspect of popular culture was coming into the building, and we're not just about football in that sense. We are football and its culture that is ingrained in the museum. So, as well as the main displays really being about the culture of football, we have temporary exhibitions which explore other aspects like football and photography, Stuart Clark, football and fashion. I hadn't realised this, and it's really dumb of me in retrospect. But on the night, I met the opening night, fantastic day. You were here.
It was a wonderful night.
Right at the end, there were a few stragglers left, and there were senior officials from Salford City Council. And for those not from here, Salford is a city as big as Manchester, or nearly as big, and it's 100 metres away.
It's like Perth and Fremantle for my West Australian listeners. Yeah,
they are right next door.
Yep.
Salford is sort of forgotten, but has as many famous actors and pop singers and...
Should we say Tony Wilson?
Yes. So it's just as famous as Manchester, or ought to be, but it isn't. Even in the people of north of England go, where's Salford? Anyway, so Salford is right here. BBC are there now, and that makes a big difference. BBC Sport, BBC Breakfast, parts of the BBC. The Blue Peter Garden of BBC's children's TV has moved up from London, is now here in Salford. So Salford is... You can see Salford. It was senior officials from Salford City Council, and they said, what's brilliant about this museum is, Kevin, it's the first museum, one of the few museums we've ever been in which has got working class culture.
Oh, wow.
And I said, yeah, of course it is. Of course it is. We had no... We were very clear on our checklist of inclusion throughout the museum, to the point we said, people, you were hitting us over the head, and we say, no we're not, gender, ethnicity, disability, but implicitly we weren't excluding certain social classes. We've got Lord Kinnaird upstairs, who's in 9 FA Cup finals. He was president of the FA. We're not saying we're only going to cover the working class part of football. That wouldn't be the true story of football. But implicitly, it's going to be about working class culture, because the game, for most of its 150-year history in England, has been. But it hadn't occurred to me. We didn't set out with the intention saying this is going to be a museum of working class culture to the exclusion of anything else. But it's one of the few museums in this country that genuinely does properly reflect all aspects of working class culture.
And that's why when you and I talked about this years ago, we've known each other a long time now, but we talked about it. That's why the lack of DCMS funding for this museum was so upsetting for the pair of us, because it was a place of working class culture that was not being supported by the government, Labour government.
But you could, yes, and despite our best efforts, but you could say about Beamish, the North of England Open Air Museum, or Ironbridge Gorge Museum, which is to an extent a museum of working class life as well, because it's industrial heritage. I mean, basically, we still have in this country, and others have written about this, a hierarchy in museums. And it used to be fine art at the top, with decorative arts below, and you'd come down, and at the bottom would be industrial heritage.
Yes.
And then when it was a newer subject, the post-E.P. Thompson influenced people coming into museums, social history was even lower, right at the bottom.
Yeah.
We've got a new top. That's contemporary art. That's gone above fine art. Fine art used to be number one. The National Gallery was the ultimate place. It's not.
Tate Modern.
And at the very bottom, as a subset of social history, which is kind of just about accepted now, well, no more than that. New museum in Liverpool, of the history of Liverpool. Fantastic. Museum. Multi-million-pound museum. Below that, right at the very bottom, are museums of sport. And other rest, it is. I honestly feel that sport is seen as, but sport. I actually have people say to me, but how can you have a museum of football? It's not old enough. It's not important. Why is that an aspect of our culture we should have in a museum at all?
And see, if we think about the stuff that we spend time on in our life, it doesn't matter 1% as much as sport does in people's lives. You think about it economically, just as a series of industries, let alone anything
else. Might be blindingly obvious to us, and it's only grown in significance in the UK in recent years and around the world. So I think people are beginning to find that argument harder to stick, but it's still there, definitely. Yeah. And contemporary art is where it's at, and I love some contemporary art. Yeah. But there is a hierarchy in music. It sounds like I'm moaning, but it's not. It's true. Which is why we formed what was the Sports Heritage Network for the sports museums. We've changed the name of it recently to the Sport in Museums Network.
Interesting.
Because we wanted to include all museums who may be interested in doing something with sport.
Oh, that's clever.
Because we did a survey, we've got Arts Council funding as well, we're recognised as a very good specialist subject network. In fact, we got the biggest grant of all the specialist subject networks. There's one for archaeology and fine art and plastics and all sorts of things. And we got the biggest grant. We've got a project worker. And our role is to work with the sports museums, of course, there's a growing number. But so many museums have sport in collections, almost don't realise they've got them. They're catalogued as fine or decorative arts or social history or you name it. And they want to work with those collections, and they need advice and help and support to do that. So for example, some of them are on a grand scale. National Museums Liverpool, with its new Museum of Liverpool, they don't really need our help. They're in our network. We work with them still. Of course, they reflect sport. How can you not have sport in a Museum of Liverpool of both football, the Grand National, all sorts of things? So, for example. But it's in the big national museums as well, and we do work with the British Library in our network, the National Archive is. We do talk to people at the British Museum. If you put into a search of the British Museum or the V&A's collection, you put football in, hundreds of items come up. It's almost like they don't know they have this material. So every museum in Britain has material relating to sport. Then there are orphan collections that don't have a home, like boxing. There are lots of museums which still don't have a home, and our job is to help support those as well. Major sports. So the Sporting Museum Network exists to do that. Yeah. And then alongside that, we, the National Football Museum, so I'm chair of that, and I will help people so much as far as I can, but there's a limit to my time and that of the project manager, Dr. Justine Riley. So we're actually now consultants as well. This has happened by accident. So there is plans to have a Paralympic Heritage Centre at Stoke Mandeville, which we're supporting as paid consultants through an HLF bid. It's going soon to round 2, looking very positive for 1.3 million from the HLF. So there'll be a heritage display at Stoke Mandeville, which can only be quite small, but it is at the place where Dr. Gutmann began the Paralympics in 1948.
That is amazing.
And then there will be... But Britain should be so proud of this.
I know.
Yeah? A German Jew doctor escaping the Nazis comes here and effectively creates the Paralympics and then sees it through several decades later. And then there will be hubs, because... People, it's got to be national, and not everybody's going to go to Aylesbury, and there's only room for something very small there. So the National Football Museum will be a Paralympic hub for the Northwest on all sports. And we're also been paid as consultants to help Rugby League. It's another great sport without a museum to decide where its museum's going to be, and we've been evaluating bids. And there were several bids. Wigan, Leeds and Bradford made the final shortlist, and the National Rugby League Museum will be in Bradford, because Bradford City Council made the best bid, and Bradford has the most amazing civic space now.
It does.
And it's amazing town hall, and they are offering at least part of their very, very wonderful Victorian town hall. This is from a time when I'm told that in the 1890s, Bradford... I'm told this, was the richest city in the world per capita, richer than New York and London. There were some very poor people in Bradford, but it was so wealthy on the woolen trade. It was incredibly wealthy and diverse. There's a little area just to the north called Little Germany, and that's where all these merchants and engineers and people from the German wool trade came move over, and that's what brought Delius's parents, the composer, to Bradford. So,
that is unbelievable. But also, I'm incredibly proud of Bradford, because I did work there 25 years ago, and that city centre was a mess, really.
Yes.
And then, you remember this, the National Museum of Photography, Film and Television. The first was... I think it was Colin Ford, wasn't it?
Yes.
Came in, I interviewed him, bless him, and he was fantastic, and that was crucial because that city centre was a mess. The work they've done on that city centre now is incredible.
Coming back. Bradford fell even further.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really very sad for a city of 400,000 people.
Yeah.
And it's on the up. They've created a fantastic public space with an amazing water feature. Go and see it. It's brilliant. Yeah. They are regenerating some of the city centre buildings, and they're on the up. And they are defending themselves. A brilliant story when I met the leader of the council. He said that the Daily Mail were after a story, and they were saying, Bradford's has the youngest population. What do you put that down to? And he said, that the angle they were trying to take was, well, you've got a lot of people from different ethnic minorities here, and they're having a lot of kids, aren't they? So he said, well, why are you the youngest city in Britain? And he went, sex.
Yeah.
And they said, well, what do you mean? He says, well, sex. People in Bradford are the happiest people in Britain. They're having lots of sex and having lots of children.
And the Daily Mail must have loved that answer.
I don't think...
That's a way to kill a story for the Daily Mail.
That's a way to kill a story dead. So we're helping with the other sports museums. That's an important role. Paralympics. I mean, come on, Britain. And the HLF should go through with that. Rugby League. And I'm also on the board of an £18 million heritage centre at Silverstone, which is going to be 9 million HLF funded to create an independent... It's a charity, it's an independent museum. Well, it's going to be an experience, forgive me for that, I'll turn it off, at Silverstone, devoted to motor racing. So, actually, we seem to have turned a corner here. Wow. I think partly because of the National Football Museum, because of the network, that sports museums... Certainly the Heritage Lottery Fund and the Arts Council are getting it, because sports museums have this... Sport is part of culture, of course it is, and it reaches audiences that other museums can't necessarily reach. So National Horse Racing Museum is going to be reopening soon with a new gallery funded by Heritage Lottery Fund, and as part of that they are redoing the gallery which holds the British Sporting Art Trust, which is a fantastic collection of British sporting art, boxing, horse racing, which is actually technically part of Tate Britain's collection, but is at Newmarket. So I think we've turned a corner.
But through your leadership too. Come on, claim it.
Myself and Paul Mains, who was the head of the River and Rome Museum in Henley, because in 2012, and Paul led this, we said we've got to celebrate. We were going to do it anyway before London got the Olympics. Local sports heritage, sports stories. So in 2012, we cajoled and got the funding and got local enthusiasm. There were 112 exhibitions of sporting heritage across England. There were others in Wales and Scotland. We covered England. More than 1 million people saw those exhibitions.
That's amazing.
And that revealed that, crikey, Britain is the birthplace of modern sport.
It is.
And therefore, we don't value this enough.
No.
The rest of the world values it. I've taken Indian scholars to Lord's, and this is like a shrine. You know, I get that. I'm a cricket fan, but we don't realise what this
means. I mean, you don't realise, when you come and you actually see the Etihad Stadium. I got chills this morning. It's like, oh my goodness! I sort of had to take a breath and have a think. It's almost quasi-religious as an experience.
It's a good tour. It's a very good tour at the Etihad, and we do group marketing with them.
It is. It's remarkable. Now, I want to get technical with you for a moment, if I can. One of my other interests, and your interest as well, is sound. Right, and particularly sound in museums. And when I did work originally on Urbis 1.0, if you will allow me to say that, I was conscious there were problems with sound. There was a lot of bleeding of sound between the exhibitions. Sound and architecture didn't quite gel together. So have you found some sound leakage or some sound challenges with this architecture, noting, particularly in the Preston experience, your use of oral history and the capacity to capitulise that oral history was very well done. So have you managed that problem?
Yes. I mean, working with our designers, Mather & Co., done a lot of sports museums, and there are issues with that. I mean, this is a museum full of sound and music. It's everywhere. And you inevitably get some bleed, you do. But we try and work around that. And I never answered the question in the first place. It's a beautiful building, but it's not great inside for exhibitions in some ways. Circulation was not right. We had to put an escalator in, move some stairs. The architect loves we're in here. He's a football fan. He loves it. He was just told, in fairness, to build a building that would have exhibitions in it. He didn't even know what the content was going to be. So it was a really ridiculous brief that he got. He built a beautiful building. So he's delighted. He just said, I wanted to see it full of people. I'm a football fan. I think it's great. There were some issues. It staggers up beautifully.
Yes.
It's too small. We've got so much material. We'd love to have new galleries and other features. So, in some ways the building isn't big enough. But that just shows the power of the story. That's not the problem with the building. We inherited the building. There is a lot of sound. You've got to. It's not a museum for hush and quiet. There are places where you can contemplate, particularly, therefore, we separate them.
Yes.
And I think it works. So we have our Pepper's Ghost, where we have Gary Lineker and Jeff Hurst talking about winning the World Cup. There shouldn't be too much sound from elsewhere there. But particularly, the place called The Minute Silence, where we, in the words of Lord Justice Taylor from his report after the Hillsborough disaster, talk about the terrible disasters in English football and Scottish football, because we cover all those covered in the Taylor report, which included Ibrox disaster, and the changes that need to be made. Now, obviously, that needed to be, it's not a shrine, but it needed to be quieter and more contemplative and respectful as a result. So, and then we have our big cinema show, 1 month in English football, which is noisy, but it's loud, but it's not too loud, but it's impactful, but it's in a separate cinema space.
So it has been fascinating for me looking at the two museums in the same space, which is very rare to see.
Yes.
And the management of sound, because you have managed it incredibly well, and that's from really thoughtful planning from a soundscape perspective, I'd imagine.
Yes. Working designer, there were constraints on the building, but in many ways, in fairness to the Urbis people, we had the funding to black box the museum, because when it was created, there wasn't really any artefacts in it. No. It's called the Museum of Urban Life, but it had no artefacts. Effectively, it was a show. It was a series of interactives. So light wasn't a problem. We're a museum. We need to protect. We need to, and also, so ideally, a museum designer wants a big black box.
Yep.
Height. It doesn't care. If it's iconic on the outside, fine, but I want a big black box.
Yep.
So we had to create black boxes here because there was far too much daylight and heat. Freezing in winter, boiling in summer, so we had to do some adjustments, putting lobbies on,
Wow.
things to reduce solar glare, things to equalise the temperature. It's a brilliant building, but it opened in 2002. It was Millennium Fund. It was so it was supposed to open in 2000. It opened the day before the Commonwealth Games started. Oddly enough, there's a coincidence. But it's built from 2002. It's a giant glass greenhouse in the centre of Manchester. It's a beautiful building, but it has no double glazing and no solar panels. I mean, really, to have been built in 2002 and not be an eco building, it was probably the last vestige of a building that you could build. If you built this building now, it would. Well, the Co-op HQ they built round the corner was the greenest building in Britain. You know, it's almost entirely self-sustaining, and that's what we would be now. You know, we'd have utility running costs here of like 3p a year. You know, you would make this self-sustained and it'd be green. It's not, but it's a beautiful building.
It is, and you've managed it beautifully. Speaking of the North, and you and I have spoken a lot about the North today in our conversations, I haven't asked you yet about your vibe on the Northern powerhouse rhetoric that exists, and is that helping or hurting museums, particularly in the Northwest?
Well, we don't really see any evidence of what this means. It does seem entirely, I'm afraid, rhetoric, this Northern powerhouse. That was talked up by George Osborne and David Cameron. If it had substance, great. We are getting an elected mayor for Liverpool and for Greater Manchester. Greater Manchester makes sense because Manchester is actually only a relatively small population, 300,000 people, something like that. But the whole area is 2 million people. This is Bolton, Bury, Rochdale, Oldham, Stockport. It's big. It's big. It's a metropolis. Liverpool the same, Merseyside. So that's positive, but none of them haven't got any extra money. You've got an elected mayor who, Andy Burnham, is the Labour candidate, a very big supporter of the museum, by the way, regardless of your politics. He's a great fan of the museum. But if there's no extra money, that's not much help. We haven't seen any extra for culture. I mean, to be frank, all we're seeing is cuts, because the local authorities are being cuts. We're seeing museums closing. We're seeing reductions for the national museums, like National Museums Liverpool now has less money to run on. It's DCMS funded. They've had big cuts, lots of staff laid off. So I'm sorry, at the moment it just looks like cuts and a reduction. That's happening across Britain. I'm not singling out the North, though we do know that northern councils have, this is just a fact, been hit harder in percentage terms. That's just that's a fact. I'm not making a political point. Manchester City Council is saying bigger cuts than equivalent local authorities in the south of England. That's a fact. Then we have politically driven decisions to create something like a £15 million Shakespeare museum theatre reconstruction in Prescott. When it was on our regional news, people in Prescott had no idea of the connection with Shakespeare and Prescott. There is plans for a new arts centre in Manchester called The Factory, in some ways in honour of Tony Wilson, Anthony H. Wilson, great man I admire him hugely. But George Osborne put up the capital funding for this, but where's the revenue?
Yep.
And we're not really sure what this is.
No.
What exactly is it? It runs the danger of being Urbis Mark II unless we define what it is. And is that need? Because in some ways the existing museums and cultural attractions in Manchester need the revenue support. Maybe we don't need another one at the moment, or great to have, but hang on a minute, let's get the ones we've already got to flourish. I mean, I think the worst thing of all was this £5 million for a great show of the North. As a one-off, it does look, I'm afraid, like a crumb to the North. You know, you haven't got a lot, so let Blackpool, Sheffield and Bradford fight for a one-off exhibition showcasing the best of the North. I mean, I'm sorry,
Yuck. You're
You're admitting there's a problem. You're not doing one for the South or for Scotland? No, not for Scotland, but... You know, it does look like a crumb, I'm afraid. It doesn't... It's not a good idea. I'm sorry.
No.
I'll go and see the exhibition and I'll enjoy it when it happens, but there's more fundamental issues with cultural attractions, museums and culture generally in the North. In a thriving... The whole of Britain is, I'm not saying that, but, you know, we've got to admit that Manchester, Liverpool, Newcastle, the northern cities are culturally... Powerful, and particularly in terms of football and popular music, incredibly powerful.
Internationally
Yes.
powerful.
Yes.
Eastbourne's not well known for its music industry. whereas Liverpool
Yes.
is. Yes, yet it's all happening. Now, we've talked about cuts, and we're going to go into this a little bit if we can. Your career is fascinating in so many ways, but you've always maintained those links between museums and universities. You've inculcated those links, you've socialised those links, you've made them work. How are you finding at the moment the museum link and its linkage with the academic scholarship on football? How's that going for you?
Yeah, I mean, we continue to be very positive about that because there's no point in not being. There are more scholars working around football history and culture, moving into visual culture, which is great. So we just keep pressing on. It's not a good time for universities in this country in terms of research funding because, I hate to say it, I'm not taking a view on Brexit in what I'm saying, but for universities this is not good. A lot of European funding came for universities, so that funding come from somewhere else? Setting aside that, we've just pressed on and secured quite a lot of funding working with the university. We'll work with anybody. The National Football Museum is on the advisory board for Cambridge University's doctoral training programme. So we'll
Wow.
work with. We're delighted to be working with the University of Cambridge. But we have collaborative PhDs, several on the go, where we work with the university to go and get money from the Arts and Humanities Research Council.
Yes.
So we've had several with International Football Institute, John Hewson at University of Central Lancashire. We have one with Dr. Michael Marnie at Bristol University on art of football at the moment. Probably forgetting others that we work with. I don't want to single too many places out, but we've always worked very well with International Centre for Sports History and Culture at De Montfort University. And then last year we spoke with the AHRC. There is another pot of funding where the museums and cultural organisations hold the PhDs, not the universities. It's only...
Fascinating.
Yeah. So it's the likes of the British Museum and the V&A that can apply, and English Heritage. And we decided that on our own we weren't big enough.
Right.
And so we applied as a consortium of the 7 sports museums, and we were successful. I'm not going to say we were lucky. We put in a great bid. We put in a bid that we wanted to do research around issues of diversity and inclusion in sport, based on the collections of the museums. And it was great. We've got 9 PhDs over 3 years. In the first tranche we've got women in the football industry over the last 25 in the Premier League era, which will be very, very interesting indeed. It's not just Karen Brady.
No.
That's with the University of Durham. We have one at Manchester Met with the River and Rowing Museum on women in rowing, which has a very long history. We've got one on the Asian community in Leicester, and with the University of Leicester, not De Montfort, on particularly South Asian community in Britain and cricket, with the Cricket Museum at Lord's. And the next so there'll be 6 more PhDs. We haven't chosen them yet. They come in tranches, and they will be one will be on rugby league, one will be on rugby union, one will be on hockey. We know that's going to be on women's hockey, in some aspect of women's hockey, because they have a fantastic collection on women's hockey.
Yes.
And one will be on horse racing. But they're all through the lens of diversity and inclusion. So we're delighted because we're working with the British Museum, the V&A. We're on their level. This is great.
This is phenomenal. And if you require an examiner, a doctoral examiner at any time, you have a short blonde friend who is available. You've discussed already the relationship with visual culture. I just wanted to, and I've been doing work seeing where you've been moving in the last couple of years in particular, and you've implemented what looks like Manchester sports writing events.
Yes.
So how is the work you're doing now, and this is new, linking with sports journalism and the emerging areas of sports fiction and sports media? What's happening, mate?
Yeah, we get frustrated sometimes, but there's no point in being like that. We're still a relatively small organisation. We raise half our money ourselves. We operate on 3.7 million a year, and 1.85 million comes from Manchester. So we just go out there and we be positive. So there are so many things we could do with artists, with poets, etc., and we do. It depends on grant funding often. The Manchester Football Writers is great, and that just came from our what was then our head of marketing. It wasn't from a sort of creative exhibitions, collections, but he just had a chat with somebody in Waterstones that he met, and they just said, wouldn't it be great to work together on a football writers festival?
Manchester.
So it's great. So we just invent something, and it's taken off. So it's half here and half at Waterstones and at other venues, and so you just find a partner, and it works. So, and from little seeds, by the time it gets to year 2 and 3, it has quite a reputation. So I think we could do a lot more, but these things take time to get established. I mean, we could do stuff around poetry, around photography. The sky's the limit. It's just we are dependent on getting grant funding, and we do. I mean, we've got a lot from the Arts Council, from HLF. We'd love to do more. We're always looking for partnerships are crucial.
Yeah.
Partnerships are crucial. We couldn't do that without Waterstones. Of course it benefits Waterstones. Waterstones has taken a commercial decision here. But that's fine. We got invited to do an exhibition at Harvey Nichols in Dubai. So we did.
Yeah.
But it benefits Harvey Nicks and it benefits us. And it gets our brand out there.
And the partnership and collaboration thing, that's what the creative industry's vibe was about 15 years ago, and we seem to have lost that. It's not one group making money and taking it off another. No, it's both
mutual
gaining.
benefit. So when Harvey Nicks in Manchester, which is 100 metres away, found out about the one in Dubai, because a lot of staff have moved between the two, we want one of those, why haven't we got one? So we did one there as well. You say, well, why don't you do that? The museum's here, Harvey Nicks is there, it's only 100 metres away, why did you bother to do an exhibition in Harvey Nicks there? Because it's in Harvey Nicks there, and it takes us to a different audience. We could also sell some. We had a bit of retail as well. It brought people to the museum here who were in Harvey Nicks there. Why not be in Harvey Nicks in Manchester? Why not?
Why? And that's the question. I want to do our last little bit, if I can, particularly focusing on you. You wrote 2 chapters in the Routledge Handbook of Football Studies, which was great, and you were also one of the editors, which I was thrilled to see. So the museum culture and heritage culture. Through your career, how are you feeling football studies, if I can use that interdisciplinary phrase, football studies has changed?
Yeah, well, it's changed a lot. In that there was nothing wrong, so don't get me wrong, with studying hooliganism, but that's where it kind of started, and there was project funding. And that's good. We did need to study hooliganism. It was a big problem. It still is. We needed to understand it. But it was kind of like it was getting pigeonholed as hooligan studies. We were just studying venom. So some people, various people, Steve Redhead, others moved away to look at fan culture more widely. Let's not just study the hooligans, They were always a minority of the fans, after all. So it became cultural, which is great. It became historical, which is great. And and now it's taking on visual culture. I'm still waiting to an extent for it to take on material culture, because people will move on to visual culture as popular culture, visual culture, and also fine and decorative fine art, as Mike O'Mahony and others do, and John Hewson with studies of football painting.
Wonderful.
But it still seems people are very shy about actual objects. And when I did my study of the 66 ball in my book, Museums and Popular Culture, 1997, and I've done a study of Diego Maradona's shirt with John Hewson. Yeah. People still seem uncertain about objects, and objects are central to a museum. We're visual culture, but we're material culture, and it is a point of evidence. There's been some work, we're getting into it, Gene Williams and others, sculptures, so we're getting there, but that seems to have taken a long time. Historians are still wanting to study documents and proper history and written history. Not a problem with that. I'm glad it's changing in that it is diversifying. I think there's some fantastic work being done internationally, and part of the issue there is it's not always translated. I mean, so bluntly, we're quite ignorant in the sense, if it's in the English-speaking world, we can just about keep up with it in English language journals, but, when there's a conference in Brazil with 200 scholars who are studying football culture in Brazil, and I asked, well, what's the standard good to scholars from here who went? I did it by Skype, I couldn't go, and they said, yes, it was really good. You think, my goodness me, and that's only in Portuguese, and there's the same material in German and others. So I think language is still a major problem, in that there is an explosion of studies. I think there's almost sometimes too much written. I think some of it is of lesser quality, but generally it's an explosion, so it's impossible to keep up with it all. It's brilliant that it's from sociological perspectives, cultural studies, history, visual culture, but my goodness me, how can we How can we keep up with all? The Handbook of Studies was an attempt to synthesise that, but it's already out of date because there are so many scholars in this field. How do we bring them together? And then we find out, so following the visit by the President of China here last year, we had 16 minutes. I showed him some objects from the collection. Next week, I'm going to China. I'm going to the Chinese Football Museum, the Lindsay Football Museum. We formed a partnership with them. We're speaking about football from an academic perspective on association football. They'd lined up some speakers who were going to tell us about who are studying the ancient Chinese game of Sichu, which is the ancient Chinese game of football. When I met the president, the first thing I said to him was, we invented modern football, association football. I appreciate you invented football with your game of Sichu 2,500 years ago. And it's not, I wasn't being polite. I was being factually correct because this had players, professionals, a league, goalposts.
Yes.
It just like the Chinese invented everything. This is
yes.
football. It's just a different kind of football in a very advanced civilization. There's Xi culture 2,000 years ago. So they have a museum of this and they have scholars on this. Well, this is a whole other branch of scholarship that we're not yet connected with. So it's almost impossible to keep up with it all. I still think, though, the study of sport is still looked down upon. It's more accepted, and I think it was a real breakthrough as getting the 9 PhDs from the AHRC.
Absolutely.
But it's still seen as a little bit of a luxury hobby subject. Yeah. Museums are even further behind sport, but even in academia still, I still think there's a sense in which this is a hobby. Is this a... Crikey, you can study sport?
I wonder, I hadn't actually written this question down, mate, but I will ask it. We found in the UK with colleagues at Bath and Bournemouth, colleagues at Waikato in Aotearoa, New Zealand, Maryland in the States, and also Steve and I are doing work in this area about and around physical cultural studies. This is becoming a bit of a new area, a new phrase. So it's thinking about movement cultures, and sport, organised sport is part of that, but it is about bodies moving.
Yes.
Do you think that's a way that material culture, analogue, digital, might work a bit better?
Because all I've talked about is cultural studies and history and that. I haven't talked at all about sports science and this whole movement, the study and the body, and this links sport and art and everything, doesn't it? Quite possibly. So it's all very exciting, isn't it? And multidisciplinary, but that's sometimes both a strength and a weakness. And there's certainly a sense here for historians. So let's just, if we come back just to the historians...
Because that was our training, really. That's
so
where we
if you
work.
come back to the historians, there's still a strong sense that historians of sport, well, that's not proper history. It's not economic or social history or diplomatic history or what have you. It's kind of like, let's face facts, there aren't any sport... Well, there's what? Are there any sports historians at the University of Cambridge, for example? Yes, one, Chris Young. But Chris Young is a professor of medieval German literature. He's a sports historian on the side as a hobby. He's very good at it, but it's a hobby. Now, the University of Cambridge is... but the argument is, we're not expecting you to take up sports history and have a whole department, but for it to be acceptable that you have in your mainstream modern history department, somebody who writes a lot about sports history, because they do.
And it also allows innovative methods and methodologies to emerge: oral history, social history, unobtrusive research methods, physical culture. So you can't understand 1966, and you've got a wonderful exhibition on 1966 at the moment, without thinking about that ball. You have to activate methods to understand a ball.
Yes. And the other thing I'd say is there's this danger also of us pigeoning ourselves as sports historians.
Yes, well said.
And sports cultural studies people, because we're not. Because I don't think I know many people who just write about... I don't, who just write about sport. No. The best historians, cultural studies, sociologists write about all sorts of things, aspects of popular culture, and sport's one of them. So if I take an historian as an example, I'm just going to pick one example of an historian. Dave Russell. Dave Russell has written some great stuff on sport and English football. Football in the English is still a great book.
It is.
But actually, you'd probably say Dave isn't a sports historian. He's an historian of popular music in England and of northern popular culture. And he happens to have some of that work is on football.
Exactly.
Some of it. But he's not. So we don't pigeonhole him as sports historian.
No.
We are cultural studies people, sociologists and historians, and we have an interest and we write about sport. But don't shove us in some department somewhere called sport.
I agree with you, and I think maybe physical cultural studies will do some interesting work there. Let's watch that. Last couple of questions, mate, and I am asking a popular culture question. So much of your career has looked at museums and popular culture, and I'm increasingly pessimistic about popular culture, except for Peter Capaldi's Doctor Who. I'm obsessed by Peter Capaldi's Doctor Who.
It's a great Doctor Who. I love him.
He is unbelievable. He is fantastic, but a lot of popular culture at the moment is, well, dodgy, I would argue, not very good. What's your perspective on the current state of popular culture and perhaps also popular cultural studies?
Ooh, good question. Yes, there is a question of whether popular culture is a vibrant expression of working class life, etc., or is it being completely commercialised? I mean, there's always that tension in popular culture, and it's always been there. Is it even more commercialised at the minute? Quite possibly, and Americanised in a way. But we've always said this tradition in English cultural studies that goes back to 40 or 50 years to Hoggart and all of those. We're all being Americanised, and you wonder whether it's actually true. I mean, part of what you see in Britain, I'm going to be positive, part of what you see the other way is an amazing new urban popular culture, which is so multicultural, it's not true. What's actually happened isn't Daily Mail Britain, it's a brilliant mix of Islam and Hindus and people of all different cultures mixing, in certain places. It's extraordinary and something really... I'm not saying there isn't racism and Islamophobia and all sorts of problems, but, the world is changing. Yeah. When you've got, and I think it was a brilliant example today, the Lord Mayor of Manchester is gay, and he has a male consort. I'm sorry, I didn't check if they're married or not, but his consort for the year is I think, his partner, maybe his husband. Now, that was unthinkable, even in gay-friendly Manchester 20 years ago, maybe 10 years ago. And Manchester is a very gay-friendly city. Yes. There are still problems with homophobia here, of course there are. And the gay rights movement in Manchester, the gay community here, so the LGBT community says it's not as vocal as it once was, Yeah. But that is, what a fantastic symbol when today the Prince and the Duke and Duchess, the Prince William and Kate come in and they meet the Mayor of Manchester and his male partner, and this is normal. This is completely normal. Now, of course, it should be completely normal, but you look back at Britain 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago, so I'm actually quite positive, because there are some real problems in working class communities here, and we have a real problem actually with poverty porn. P-O-R-N, where basically
poverty porn.
The cameras go to Grimsby or somewhere and try and show that all working class people are lazy, criminals, stupid, never work. And what you actually see is the complete opposite. Decent people fighting hard, bringing their kids up, struggling to make ends meet, and a lively culture. And by and large, actually, they're not racist. The people who actually mix with people from different cultures who live in their street aren't racist, and they're not racist because they're their neighbours and friends, and they've got used to them being there. Yeah. So I'm actually very positive. I think we have a real problem in this country at the moment. Owen Jones's book, Chaps, of denigrating working class people.
Well said.
And I actually think we still have as vibrant a working class culture here. Obviously, with people who are very poor at the moment in certain communities, it's hard. Yeah. But there's still a thriving culture.
And I think that's what we need more of. We need that relationship between working class culture and popular culture to continue to dance and dialogue like it always has.
And to bring it back to football, I'm going to bring it two things. One, to the museum. Over 40% of our audience are C2DE.
Yep.
Broadly, we reflect society. Most museums do not. Most museums do not. We do. So people feel comfortable here. It's a subject they're comfortable with. And they see Picasso. They come in and they're surprised because they see a Picasso. The problem football's got, so let's be quite clear what I mean by football. Elite level football, the Premier League. Maybe the Championship as well. At all levels of the football, it's still, women's game is going great guns, LGBT football, we're still tackling racism in the game. But the elite level, one statistic, I think the average age of season ticket holders at Premier League clubs is way over 40, and in German football it's something like 20 years younger.
Fascinating.
So we have a real problem that we are pricing out a younger generation of fans. That culturalisation into the game where your mum, your dad, it was your dad in my time, women didn't go to the game so much, your granddad took you to the game and you were introduced to the game, and therefore you became a fan, or didn't. You might say, I hate this, but you became a fan. That's not happening. You might go to one game a season, you might not get hooked on one game. So there's a whole generation of kids who don't go because they can't afford to go. And so their experience of football is watching it on TV. And I think that's a problem.
Yeah, it is. And I think it was Paul Virilio who used that phrase, those absent from the stadium are always right. So actually arguing that we've got this whole group of new fans that are outside of the stadium. But that authenticity, you often talk about material culture, we're losing something if you're not going to the game. The digitisation of football, I think, is a very big area we have to address for what we lose as much as what we gain.
Yes. Everybody who's ever been to a sports event or a football match knows that the experience of going to the football match is so radically different to watching it on TV. It's the same result, but that's all that's the same.
Yeah.
It is incredibly different, and actually the key component that you don't get on TV is the culture. It's the culture of the game. Bill Bryson writes about this brilliantly, his latest book, Going Around Britain. He says he takes binoculars to a football match because he spends the first half looking at all the things that you don't normally look at. Like, what does a goalie do when he hasn't got the ball? How many head turns and jumping up and down does he do? How funny it is to watch the linesman sidestep, referees' assistants. Of course, they're women as well today as well, and they're called referees' assistants, going side to side up and down the line, watching the fans' behaviour. He watches the game as well. But it's the culture of the game that is so crucial, and you don't get any of that.
Exactly, and particularly
on TV.
particularly when we're losing that socialisation of grandfathers and fathers with their sons and daughters. We're losing that.
Yes,
you know.
And just at the point where we want to open the game up to women and families more, they're priced out of the game. I'm sorry, it's just a fact.
Yeah.
It's great that some of those people. It's not great. There is a small positive in that some of those people are saying, right, well, we'll take them to women's football. And those crowds, because we can afford to get in there. In the way that I knew people who 20 years ago took their kids to reserve matches because they could afford those. Now we don't have that system of reserve matches. But I know a lot of people in the north of England who said we stopped going to football and we started going to rugby league.
Yeah.
Because we can afford to go to a rugby league match. And it's pretty much the same experience. It's safe. It's actually a more pleasant atmosphere. There is a bit of an edge sometimes, but you can get in and you can afford to go.
Exactly, and it's exciting. Last question, particularly it might resonate on that financial discussion we just had. My last question is an important one, and I've just come from Prague in the last few days, so this is quite moving really. What do you believe will be the impact of Brexit on the GLAMs, on galleries, libraries, archives and museums? Do you see it as a direct link, a causal link, a casual link? What's your vibe at this point?
I think I'm picking up from other people in the cultural sector here in Britain, this is an absolute disaster because that reflects they're all Remainers. Now, I personally am a Remainer, but I think we have to keep this in perspective. The first thing to say is because our music, and it maybe reflects the fact that because their audience is from a more elite social class than us, most of their audience are Remainers. They are that kind of person. Nothing against them. Our audience is very diverse with a large number of working class people, a large number of people coming into this museum. Maybe a majority of our visitors voted Brexit.
Yeah.
We cannot demonise Brexit voters if you're a Remainer and vice versa. So the first thing is, our audience had both opinions on it. Culture was not discussed in the debate, so nobody had any idea what would be the impact on museums or galleries. There was a little bit, we'll lose some European funding, but it wasn't really talked about. The Manchester Evening News did actually run with a story about half of the National Football Museum, the refurb of Victoria Station next door, and this tram line, where Manchester's had a lot of European funding. So it will have an effect, no question. Let's remember half of the capital cost of this museum came from the European Union. I think the bigger problem, actually, to be absolutely honest, European funding, quite hard to get for cultural organisations, unless they're very big. Universities, yes. you have to have so many partners. It's quite complex. So apart from European Regional Development Fund for big projects that city councils could get, very hard for us. We've never had any other European funding. So actually it's not a loss to us. The biggest pressure is the local authorities across Britain and the government, after austerity and balancing the books, cutting central government and local government funds. That's the biggest pressure for culture in this country. It's not Brexit, it's central government cuts to local authority, cuts to public spending, and it's not going away, and regardless of anyone's politics, it's going to get worse.
Kevin, I didn't know the conversation would take as long as it has. It's lovely seeing you again. It's wonderful to look at you properly rather than just see you through an online environment. You are a great human being. You are a leader in this field. And I hope you know from all of our perspectives the influence of your work. You are a great human being, and it's lovely to see you again.
That's very kind. It's lovely to see you. Just to say, it's no deal signed, but the publisher of Museums and Pop Culture is interested in a revised edition. So I have decided to do this because a lot has changed in the last 20 years. There is a lot globally with museums and popular culture. It's a lot more. It's not happened as quickly as I'd hoped, but it has happened. When you get the V&A doing David Bowie and Kylie and the Supremes dresses and things, no, it was more than the Supremes dresses. It was about...
I think it was the hair as well.
Yes.
Big hair.
Yeah, I love that show.
Yeah.
But it's the dresses I clearly remember, isn't it? And I love the Supremes. It was about Motown culture more generally. But when and there's Rolling Stones and Pink Floyd exhibitions.
Absolutely.
The V&A to be doing this, then things have changed.
They have.
And so I would like to reflect on. I don't think it's a fundamental change, but it needs to reflect things that are quite different in terms of what's actually going on in museums to where we were 20 years ago.
And that book was so ahead. It did lead the field. It's a great example, too, for a lot of our PhD students around the world listen to this podcast. And it's a great example of a book leading a field. Never let anybody say books don't matter. Happens a lot in Australia at the moment, mate, where people say books don't matter. A scholarly monograph can lead the way for decades. And that book... Please go out and read that book. That book is astounding. And the idea there's a second edition, I'll be buying the first copy as it comes out, mate. A pleasure, good sir.
Thank you very much.
For more information about the Office of Graduate Research at Flinders University, please refer to www.flinders.edu.au/graduate-research.